Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how to create a WPF application with Blazor.
What?
You heard me.
How?
Well, let me finish. Okay, technically, it's a standard WPF app, but we can load a web view control to host Blazor components, effectively allowing us to build the entire UI with Blazor. And if that were all I'm showing you today, it'd still be cooler than the crappy beer being served in the cafe car. But I'm going to take this demo as far as I can go. We'll not only do JavaScript interop, but interop between Blazor and Windows. And that's all coming right up, right now, right here. You know what I'm trying to say on Blazor Train. So let me tell you how this episode came about. I was checking out the blog post that Microsoft did about .NET MAUI Preview 13, and I scrolled down and I see in the highlights there's documentation for building Blazor hybrid apps with .NET MAUI WPF and Windows Forms. And that led me to this, build a WPF Blazor app. And so I followed the instructions and did the code in this project, but it didn't work. And I figured out that the reason was because they want you to add a Razor class library component, and just the way they had it configured with the current version of the preview or whatever didn't work. Essentially, though, this is the magic. It's Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components WebView WPF. So this allows for a lightweight web browser, essentially a web view in WPF applications. Now this by itself is reason to jump for joy, but as you'll see when I create this project, there's so many things that we can do with Blazor in a WPF app. Now why would you do this? Well, I can't tell you if you're building a greenfield application to build a Blazor WPF application. You might want to do that, but more likely is that you've either got Blazor content and you've been messing around with it, but your main application that you build is a WPF application and you want to kind of integrate the two. Or your main application is a Blazor application and somebody asked for a WPF app because WPF does more stuff than Blazor can do, whatever it is. You can now merge these two things together. All right, before we start, I want to make sure that you have at least Visual Studio in its version 17.2, Preview 1.0. If you don't, just make sure you install it. And when you install it, you want to make sure you have ASP.NET Web Development checked off and .NET Desktop Development. All right, so I'm going to create a new WPF project with Visual Studio Preview. This is going to be a WPF application, and we're going to call it WPF Blazor. So let's start with the CS project. Now I want to do a little bit of change to this. So here I've removed the null checks. I've changed the project SDK to add Razor to the end of it so that we can add Razor components. And I've added this package right here. ASP.NET Core Components WebView WPF. It is a preview version. If you're watching this after MAUI has come out and maybe .NET 7 or whatever, obviously I can't predict the future, but go to my GitHub repo at carlfranklin/WPF Blazor, and I'm going to keep up this project and explain how the latest updates work. All right, so now that we have that, let us add a new folder called www.root. And to that, we're going to add an index.html and an app.css file. All right, so here's my index.html. First thing you need to do, this is really important, change the copy to output directory setting to copy always. All right, let's always copy that out. Now let's take a look at this. This is the standard boilerplate Blazor HTML for a WebAssembly application, right? You're not going to see Blazor server stuff in here. So we've got our style sheets. Notice I don't have a bootstrap style sheet. We'll get to that. And then just the bare minimum div ID equals app with loading in there. And now you've got your blazor.webview.js in there as well. And this is pretty much the standard CSS file from a Blazor WebAssembly with maybe a couple of changes or a few things omitted. Again, make sure that you set the copy to output directory property to copy always. All right, now let's add a Razor component. And we're going to call it, guess what? Index. No, I am not going to use counter. We're going to go way beyond counter today. So here's the bare bones index. Note that I have to put a namespace directive at the top. You have to do that. Also, we're using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Web, and then whatever Blazor content you have. However, this isn't going to work by itself. In order for WPF to understand what index is, you have to have a class. So we're going to do a little code behind right here. Index Razor CS. Now, you don't need this, but you do need this basic statement, public partial class index. This is the syntax you're going to need for every Razor component that you put in WPF. But now we have this message, and it says, hey, it's Blazor in WPF. And take a look up here, we're just displaying the message. Now the next thing we have to do is go to our main window XAML CS and make a modification here. Now we've got a service collection which looks a lot like services in the builder, right? And it pretty much is. This is where we add services. So we're adding Blazor WebView right here. And now we can modify the main window XAML to host that WebView. Visual Studio is going to yell at you about services. It doesn't know what that is. That's a runtime thing, but don't worry about it. It's going to run. Let's take a look at this. So here we've got our local XML namespace, WPF Blazor. We also have a Blazor namespace for the web view. And now here's the Blazor web view. We tell it that the host page is at www.root/indexhtml and that our services is the static resource services, which if you go to the code behind, you'll see we added a resource called services, which is this service collection. And now in the root components collection, we've added one. The selector is app, and the component type is local, which is our local namespace, index. So this is all you need right here. From the index, we're going to add all of the things that we need in this one main form. But let's just run it for now. Hey, it's Blazor in WPF. Isn't that awesome? It is awesome, actually, that you can just get this far. But I want to go way beyond this. So let's do some more. Let's do a basic interaction. Here I've just got a button, and I'm saying @onClick equals click me. So now we need a click me handler in the code behind. So all I'm doing here is updating the message with the current time every time I click, just so that you know we did something. Okay, this is kind of like counter, but different. Great. Now let's add a child component. So for that, I'm going to create a components folder, and I'll add to it a new Razor component called child component. Pretty simple here. We have our namespace, which remember you have to have in every component. We have our using statement. We'll clean up the using statements in a minute. And then I just am showing the contents of a message property or field. So let's add a code behind as we need to do. Okay, so not much here. We have our message, And we're going to override oninitialized and set the message that we've initialized this component at with a timestamp. All right, now let's modify our index to support this. So I've added another using statement because the child component is in WPF Blazor components, and I'm just going to instantiate it right there. And there you go. Now you can see the child component doesn't do anything but tell us when it was initialized, but you can do whatever you want, as you'll see, because we're going to get even more complex now. Let's call into JavaScript. So I'm going to go into my index.html and I'm going to add a new script tag. And this is how I can get the width of the window from JavaScript. I'm just returning window.innerWidth. Now let's make the call in IndexRaiser. Now you can see we've injected the IJS runtime, so we can use it in the code behind. And so now let's go to the code behind click me, and we'll just replace this. Now in click me, we're going to get the width by calling await.js runtime, invoke async of int, get window width, which is the name of our JavaScript method, and I'm pulling that back and showing that in the message. All right, so it shows us the width. And there it is. If I pull it out a little bit, it all goes on the screen, 784. But now that I've widened the screen, I'll click again. Yeah, and we get a new width. That's pretty cool. Now, while I'm at it, let's go to main window XAML and change our height to 720 and our width to 1280. So we have a true 720p window. And when we run it again, it's wide enough to handle the whole string. Now, before we go any further, I told you I wanted to clean up all these using statements. Let's start that process now. I'm going to add a new component called, guess what? _imports_razor. And I'm adding the using statements that I use across my components. Now I can go into my child component, and I don't need that. I can go into my index, and I don't need those. And it still runs. Awesome. Now, we've called into JavaScript, but how about having JavaScript call us? Well, yeah, we can do that too. Let's add some things to our script. Now I've got a .NET helper outside of my methods, and here's a window.register WPF app. Passes a .NET reference, which we set right there. And now we add an event listener on window resize, and we're going to call handle resize. So handle resize on that .NET helper invokes the method window resized, passing the window inner width and inner height. So now we need a window resized method that's JS invocable in our index code behind. Not only that, but we have to call register WPF app when the application loads up. Okay, now why are we getting the squiggles? Well, because this is code behind and it needs access to Microsoft JS interop. We'll get rid of all these using statements in a minute in the code, but first let's test out the code where JavaScript calls us back. So I'm overriding on after render async here. And if it's the first render, that means that this is a good time where we can call into JavaScript to do any kind of registration. So it'll happen only once on the first render. And at this point, the JavaScript engine is already up and running. So this is the perfect point. We're saying invoke void async, register WPF app, and we're passing .NET object reference create from this being index. And that's how it knows when it calls back to call this JS invocable method, window resized, int width and height. Now, I've already done a lot on Blazor JavaScript interop, so if you've seen those episodes, this should be no surprise to you. So here we're just saying message is screen size width times height. And we're also calling status changed because this is coming from JavaScript and not from a Blazor UI action. if you're handling a button click or any kind of at, on, whatever method from a Blazor component, you don't have to call state has changed. All right, let's give this a shot. Now when the window's resized, that resize event happens in JavaScript, and it calls into our window resized method, passing the width and height, and we just show it in the message. Now we got rid of the using statements in the components, right? Now let's get rid of the using statements in all of the C# code. And to do that, we're going to go to app.xaml CS. In app.xaml CS, we can add some global usings in here. Now all the using statements we want to use everywhere in the project, we can just remove them and put them all here as global usings. So let's go to the child component razors code behind and get rid of all these using statements. Let's go to my index code behind. I can get rid of these here. And guess what? Main window XAML CS, I can get rid of those there as well. Now the code is a lot cleaner. And guess what? It still works. But you know, it doesn't look very Blazor-y. And that's because in a Blazor application, you get this bootstrap CSS file that's minimized. And what you can do though is just copy that bootstrap file into your web root and link it, and then everything just looks like a Blazor application. Let's do that. So for this, you need to create or find an existing Blazor application and just copy bootstrap min from the web root CSS folder right in here. So I'm going to go to the last one that I shared with you, BT log demo. Here's my web root, here's my CSS, here's my bootstrap, and now I can take this bootstrap.min.css and copy it into the web root, and I'm going to also set my copy to output directory to copy always. See that? And now I can go into index and we can add the style sheet here, bootstrap.min.css, just like that. Well, I can tell the font has changed, but let's add a bootstrap style to this button right here. Just like that. That's looking very Blazor. But now I notice that our margin has kind of gone away. Well, I can do a couple of things. I can add a margin here, right? But why mess with that? Why not do everything in CSS? Let's go here to our app CSS file and add this, just to give us a little padding. Now we can also do something like set the background color if you want. Whatever. It's up to you. That's looking a little better. For now, I'm going to take out the background color. Now, let's say we had more stuff in the grid other than the Blazor web view. Let's say we had some WPF controls in the grid, and we want to handle like a button click and then change something in the Blazor index file. In other words, we want to access our razor component from a WPF component. Well, I took a look at the source for Blazor web view and the root components and the root component itself, and there doesn't seem to be an easy way, at least I couldn't figure out a way to just sort of find the instance, right? So knowing that everything in programming can be solved with another layer of indirection, I chose to go to my old friend AppState and keep a reference to the Blazor index outside of both the Blazor index and the WPF window. So let's do this. We're going to add a class called AppState. Now I'm going to make this a static class with static properties. Just one property actually, and it's going to be index, which is our index razor component, and I'll just call it index component. Now I don't have to add AppState as a service because it's in the WPF Blazor namespace already, And it's static, so I don't have to create an instance of it because it is a singleton by default. We need to set index component wherever we make the index, which is in index Razor CS. So going down to onInitialized, we set appstate.indexComponent equals this. So now when our index Razor component instantiates and it's initialized, appstate will have the reference to it. Now for my message property or field, I turned it into a proper property with a backing field. And in the setter, I'm calling state has changed. And I made it public. And that is so somebody who has a reference to index can just set the message and boom, it will change. Who's going to have a reference to it? Well, appstate is just part of the project. So we can access that here in main window XAML CS. But we need a button. So let's go back to main window XAML and we'll open this grid up a little bit to have 2 rows and we'll add a button to the top row. Okay, so grid row definitions right there. The top one's going to have a height of 35 and the bottom row height is going to fill up the rest of the room. So now we have a stack panel in grid row 0 with a little bit of a margin and a button that says WPF button, and we added a handler button underscore click. The rest of this is the same, the Blazor web view, except that we put it in row 1. So now let's add that button click handler. So when the user clicks the button in the WPF app, we're going to say appstate.indexComponent.message equals shared string updated at, and the timestamp. Ready? Boom. Now in a minute, I'm going to show you how we can go back the other way. How we can call a method here in main window XAML from Blazor, and I'll give you a hint, it kind of works the same way. But first, let's consume a third-party Blazor component and see if we can get that all working. And the one that I want is Blazor Extensions Canvas. So it's an HTML5 Canvas API implementation for Microsoft Blazor. I chose this one because you're a WPF developer, or you must be if you're watching this crazy show. And, you know, WPF people like cool graphics and stuff. So let's use the canvas in a WPF app. Wouldn't it be cool? So let's start by adding the canvas package, Blazor Extensions Canvas. And we need to add the script tag in our index HTML. Script source is underscore content, Blazor Extensions Canvas, Blazor Extensions Canvas JS. Now we need to add using statements to underscore imports. Just one, Blazor Extensions Canvas. And we also need to add a couple global usings here. Now we can modify index Razor. We're going to add this BE canvas with a width of 300 and a height of 400. And we're adding this ref that doesn't exist yet because we have to add it to the code behind. So let's fix that. All right, so I've got my canvas 2D context and my BE canvas component, which is protected because we're accessing that outside canvas reference. And now I've added this code to on after render async. And this is right out of the repo. Let's run that. Boom. Okay, now I didn't say it was pretty, but it's there. Everything else still works great. Now, we've done quite a lot here, but there's still more problems to solve. For example, cascading parameters. How does that work? How would we, for example, implement a Blazor modal, Chris Sandy's modal dialog component? That requires putting a cascading Blazor modal around the router, but we don't have a router, right? Because this is a WPF application. So how do we do that? Well, I'll show you. First, we add a package reference. Now we go to the index and we add the style sheet and the script. We're going to go to underscore imports and add using statements. We're going to go to app XAML CS and add global using statements. And finally, and this may or may not be obvious to you, but right here where we added the Blazor web view, this is where we're going to add to the service collection Blazor modal, just like that. So let's create a modal. I'm going to add to my components folder a new Razor component called display message. Now remember, we have to have our namespace up here and then whatever markup we have. Let's add the code behind. Now, cascading parameter. That's funny. I don't recall creating a cascading parameter anywhere. All right, well, you will. You'll see. But we have our cascading parameter Blazor modal instance called Blazor modal. And this is how we're going to close and cancel. And we also have a parameter message. Now let's figure out how to call it. Let's go to index. Now we've injected an iModal service modal. And if you notice, we've added our cascading statement or our cascading Blazor modal around the entire UI. So you remember in a Blazor application, in app.razor, you put this around the router. That's basically so it can cascade down to every component, right? But this is our main component from which we have modal dialogues and all of that. So everything comes from here for this page. So you have to do this on every window in WPF that you want a cascading parameter. Now let's add show modal to our code behind. So this should look familiar if you've done any stuff with Blazor modal. We have our parameters. We're adding display message. Hey WPF is the message. And then we're showing it. We're not waiting on it, but we could. We're just showing it. Let's give it a shot. How about that? Awesome. Does everything else still work? You bet your sweet Bippy it does. So let's go to app state. We're going to add a new property. And guess what? It's a main window. Now, just like we did going from WPF to Blazor, we're going to do the opposite. So check this out. Let's go to the code behind for the main window, and we're going to add this guy, show message box. So this is a public method on main window. You pass it a string, and the message box pops up. Let's see if we can call this from Blazor. We're going to modify index razor. So we've added this button right here, talk to WPF, and now we have to fill in this guy right here, talk to WPF. Now remember, this is on the Blazor side, so this will be in index razor CS. There you go. appstate.mainwindow.show message box. Hey, this is Blazor calling. Here we go. Hey, this is Blazor calling. Isn't that awesome? So now Blazor can talk to WPF and WPF can talk to Blazor. Wouldn't it be cool if this WPF button could do this? Well, sure it can. So first in index razor CS, we're going to change show modal from protected to public. And now in main window XAML CS, we can comment this guy out of button click. And now say app state index component show modal. There you go. How cool is that? And that is all I have time for today, but I hope we took what you might have been expecting as a very simple demo and blown your mind. I know it blew my mind putting this thing together. Thanks to Chris Sainey for helping me get Blazor modal working, and thanks for watching. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. Here's the URL to the repo where this demo is maintained. Feel free to submit pull requests if you discover even more cool stuff we can do with it. That's right. If the cafe car insists on serving warm, crappy beer, we'll just make our own. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.